We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.
It's the same nonsense we've heard time and time again.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Planet Holyrood, the podcast all about Scottish politics. I'm Chris McCall, I'm the Deputy Political Editor at the Daily Record, and I'm standing in this week for regular host Paul Hutchin. And joining me today are two of my esteemed colleagues. I have John Ferguson, the Associate Editor of the Sunday Mail, and Ben Borland, the Editor of the Scottish Daily Express. Now, this week saw the sudden resignation of Cammy Day, a name that some Planet Holyrood listeners may have been unfamiliar with. That is until that the Sunday Mail, and a marmalade-dropping exclusive at the weekend there, revealed how he was under investigation for allegations of inappropriate behaviour. He was suspended by Scottish Labour last weekend, and then this week he resigned as leader of Edinburgh City Council. Now, John, this was a Sunday Mail splash and was reported by Planet Holyrood regular Hannah Roger. But could you maybe tell us a bit about how this story came about and really why does it matter so much?
So this is a story that my colleague Hannah had been working on for some time, a good few weeks. It came to a head last week with news that the police were involved. Towards the end of the week, they confirmed that they were actively investigating. We need to be careful what we say for legal reasons, but it's been reported as it involves inappropriate messages that have been sent to refugees of a sexual nature. So really serious allegations. I think the reason this matters is, there's several reasons. Obviously, for Cammy Day, the leader of the council, it's a huge scandal that he is going to suffer potentially enormous reputational damage as a result of. But wider than that, it's a real problem for Scottish Labour, both at the level of the local authority, where there's a minority administration which they may now lose control of. But I think what Scottish Labour and the SRL will be really worried about is that this taints the entire party in Scotland as they're preparing to fight a Scottish election in 2026. One of the big things that that Labour have been banking on behind the scenes is that they know that there's the branch form investigation into the SNP finances, which is likely to come to a head in the next year before the election. They would be hoping that is going to create a lot of scandal and reputational damage for the SNP. What they don't want is their own set of scandals that can potentially damage the party and take the heat off of the SNP, and that's exactly what these kind of things do. So it's a big problem for them at all sorts of levels, and it looks like one that's going to run for quite some time.
Yeah. Now, Ben, I think some in Labour will be hoping that because this is at a council level, maybe people living out with Edinburgh will look at this and say, well, this is a local political issue. Why should I be bothered about it? But I don't get the feeling that's the case with this, though.
I think it's a huge story. It's a great splash, lots of detail in it. And I think it's going to cause a hell of a problem for Labour.
So we should say that Cammy Day released a statement on this on Monday, in which he resigned. In resignation, he said he was stepping back because he didn't want to be a distraction to the work that Labour was doing in Edinburgh. But as John points out, that the administration in Edinburgh could, won't last that long. Potentially, we're going to have a vote in it next week, so we could have a new administration in Edinburgh and Labour out of power because they were a minority on the city chambers. The SNP, the largest party, so it stands to reason this could be a pretty big SNP gain coming down the line. But just coming back to you, John, you touched upon this in your first answer, but Anas Sarwar, he's been facing questions from reporters this week that there is a culture of this within the party because Cammy Day is not the only senior figure in local politics attached to Labour who is under investigation. We've seen Stephen McCabe, who resigned as leader of Inverclyde Council, in a separate matter. And we've also seen a senior councillor in Glasgow under investigation as well. So how does Anas Sarwar play this? Does he just say, well, look, I'm the leader of the National Party, I can't keep tabs on everyone, you know, we've got a lot of people in Labour. Or does I mean, how can he own this? Can he own this, or is it just going to be bad news all round?
Yeah, I mean, it's crisis management stuff, isn't it? There's nothing really that he can do to try to make it look all right. I think it's interesting what you say, that this is not an isolated incident, that there's several similar ongoing cases involving Labour politicians. There's also some very serious similar situations involving for former SNP high-ranking council officials, it has to be said. So I think that really it's more a problem for politics. I think there is, I think people get the impression that these people that are supposed to be, you know, representing their constituents locally, making sure that schools and are operating well, that buses are running on time, that bins are getting collected, are actually treating this job like a kind of some sort of social club, and that there's a lot of drinking going on, and that things spin out of control on a regular basis. So there's no real way, I don't think, for Anas Sarwar to put any kind of good gloss on this. It's a scandal. It's bad. All of these things are bad. They paint a bad picture of the Labour Party when they involve the Labour Party, but I think more broadly they just paint a very poor picture of politics, and at a time when people already have a pretty dim view of politicians.
I mean, on the issue of local politics, here in Glasgow, where we're recording this episode, there were a series of by-elections recently, and in one of the wards, Glasgow North East, turnout reached a whopping 12%, which kind of tells its own story about disillusionment. I mean, I know that historically people aren't often that engaged with local politics, but 12% is pretty dismal, no matter how you look at it. Ben, are you engaged in local politics? Can you tell me who the local councillor is?
I think we're in a multi-member ward, so I've got several local councils. They do quite a good job. I mean, I think, like you say, council by-elections have always had very low turnouts. I think the key thing for Labour is they won all those by-elections. They've had a bad run. I mean, Rutherglen by-election, obviously the Westminster by-election now looks quite a long time ago, when Scottish Labour, it seemed, could do no wrong. The one thing that'll be reassuring for Anas Sarwar is the fact that they are still winning. They are still winning these by-elections. I know the SNP managed to stop their losing streak in the last set. And let's not forget, the reason for all these by-elections is because all these Labour councillors have gone off to Westminster and resigned their seats because they've won these new jobs. I think it's a worrying time for Labour. I think the one thing, as well as the fact that they're still winning, it's the fact that the Holyrood party still looks quite strong. There's no crack. There doesn't appear to be any problems within the Holyrood group. So he's got problems at local authority level. He's certainly got the UK government causing him problems from above and putting him in difficult positions policy-wise. But the Holyrood group still looks quite kind of battle-hardened and quite secure.
We'll come on to Labour at Holyrood a little bit later. But talking of the Scottish Parliament, obviously one of the major areas it has control over, probably second only to the NHS, is education. And there was a barrage of statistics released by the Scottish Government on this subject yesterday. You can really take your pick about what looked worse. I mean, we saw teacher numbers have steadily dropped in recent years, despite Jenny Gilruth, the Education Secretary, being very, very keen to maintain numbers at the very least. We also saw, though, and this was on the front page of the Daily Record today, that absences, kids skipping classes, is becoming an increasing problem. And 1 in 3 pupils, that's across primary and secondary schools, are classed as being persistently absent. That's about 19 school days per year, or 10% of the total. So we're talking about a big chunk of time that kids are missing class. Now, there doesn't appear to be any one reason that's the cause of this. The COVID pandemic, which obviously closed schools for weeks on end, has been blamed in part because some kids unfortunately fell out of the habit of going to school regularly. But more broadly, on education in the state of schools, John, do you feel this is becoming an issue for the Scottish Government, the perception of public services aren't in great shape, and are schools one of them?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons that this really resonates with people is because in the past there was a genuinely held belief that education in Scotland was something that was a bit special. It was an area that we punched above our weight. That was that Scottish schools were really good, and over the last 15, 20 years, there's a feeling that that reputation has gradually slipped and is now well and truly in reverse, where schools in other parts of the UK and abroad are just delivering a much better education experience for kids. I think if there was one reason, so I mean, I think there's loads of reasons for that, but the specific thing that you touched on today, the Daily Record splash about the amount of children who are just not attending school, I think is really serious. And if you're to look at the root of that problem, or the thing that really turbocharged that problem, I think it was the pandemic. I think we've saw in England stats last week that suggest the situation there is broadly similar. The problem was that schools closed, parents were effectively told to homeschool their children for felt like over a year, and that was fine for middle class kids with college-aged parents who were educated themselves and could actually and had the time to do that job, and also the facilities in their home, both in terms of just a quiet, calm place and the access to laptops, things like that. There was just a whole plethora of reasons why this hit the most disadvantaged young people the most. And I think we're seeing the results of that now, that there is literally a generation of young people who have just fallen out of the system, aren't going to school, won't get any kind of qualifications or education to speak of, and that's a really big problem. You know, that's something that will resonate down through the generations. It doesn't just impact society now, it's going to impact crime levels, unemployment levels, mental health, everything, you know. So if there's one thing that, and it should also be remembered, this was the area that successive First Ministers have said would be their absolute top priority, dealing with child poverty and basically giving young people a better start in life, no matter their background, the attainment gap, all of that stuff. This is it's not. All governments could claim they couldn't control the pandemic, but no matter what the reasons behind it are, it really is the thing that governments of all stripes should be trying their hardest to get a grip of, because the potential downsides are just massive and will go on for decades.
And Ben, would you agree with that, John?
I would add the economy to that list. I mean, you know, these kids are going to have to drive the Scottish economy, and if I think it's the fact that they were told 2020, right, after telling your entire life you have to go to school. Actually, no, you don't have to go to school, and you can stay off from mid-March right through to the summer holidays. And let's not forget that the UK government got kids back in when the Scottish government, schools were closed, everyone was in what the hell do we do mode at the start of the pandemic. But by mid-May, the schools were reopening. But Nicola Sturgeon said, no, we want to be more safe, we want to be safer, and they stayed closed right through the summer. So my kids, they didn't go back till, and everyone's kids didn't go back till late August. So that's one big closure. And there's been evidence at the COVID inquiries that showed that the science, and the scientists used that horrible phrase, the science was showing by early summer 2020 that closing the schools was having no effect on stopping the spread. and English schools started to reopen, and Scottish schools didn't. But and then the second big lockdown, so they closed again in January 2021 and remained closed until April. So you had these two huge closures, and the second one in particular was against all the evidence, saying that kids were not spreading this virus. And the damage that it's done to generations of young people is, it's one of the biggest calamities to come out of COVID. I think I really do, and you can understand if you're told twice by the First Minister, no less, as well as all your teachers and your head teachers, that actually skipping school for 4 or 5 months at a time is no big deal, then that's in your head for the rest of your school, and you go, do you know what? I'll just skip it. I don't know if I think this is quite prevalent in Scottish schools, and it seems to be more a recent thing. The last week of term, I'd be interested to know any feedback on this. The last week of term, it's almost now regarded as a free holiday. Yeah. Lots of schools. I know of schools where teachers don't go in on the last week of term. So next week, coming up to Christmas, most schools will break up Thursday, Friday. Actually, they probably break up at the end of this week, because the last week's just a write-off. And that all counts towards the persistent absence figures.
John, just briefly, teacher numbers, is there a way of squaring this? Because the school roll, the total number of kids is going down. Like, the school roll has dropped by 3,000 just in the space of a year. So are we actually, is the Scottish Government have to come to terms with the fact that we're going to require fewer teachers? Because if that is the case, now I don't know if it is, but that would be politically tricky, to put it mildly, given the emphasis on education that the government naturally has, but also the power of the teaching unions is pretty considerable in Scotland. And we already have teaching graduates complaining that they can't get permanent jobs. So is this an issue that's bubbling away and could spill over quite soon, do you think?
I mean, I guess, so obviously the number of teachers you need is determined by the number of pupils that you need to teach. So I guess the measurements that you should be looking at are class sizes, as that, how many children are in each class, and it's like the accepted wisdom is that the smaller the class sizes, the better. So are we hitting our targets in terms of class sizes? And also, I think this is a really big question. Do we have the teachers to cover all of the key subjects in secondary schools? There's been stories the last few weeks about lack of modern language teachers, so kids just aren't learning language. Also, I know from my own children's school that they're perhaps not getting as many hours as maths as they should be getting, because they just don't have enough maths teachers. So those STEM subjects, or there's issues with the provision. So I think that's the two metrics that you need to look at if you're assessing whether we have enough teachers to actually deliver the educational needs of kids.
I think the thing with sorry to jump in, education, it's such a key. You've got the NHS and education, arguably the two biggest areas of concern for voters that Holyrood has control over. And you could probably say, look, the NHS is kind of unfixable. I don't think a health secretary is going to come in and fix the NHS, whereas education can be fixed. This is something that is a manageable problem. And we know that because other parts of the UK and other countries are fixing it.
I think a problem with democracy is that, ironically, if there's one thing, if a country was a start-up business, then you would probably invest almost everything in education and very little in sort of services for old people. But we're not. We live in a democracy where kids don't have a vote, and old people are vote more than anyone else. And so what we see is a constant lack of resources going into education, kids, and disproportionate amount going into services for older people.
Ironically, the amount of investment that's gone into the school buildings is quite good. I mean, I'm sure everyone watching this all over Scotland, I see brand spanking new school buildings. So the school estate, when I first came to Scotland, it was the stories were always about Scotland's crumbling schools. That seems to be, but it's actually what happens inside the schools is the
I
problem.
would agree
now.
with that. The school I went to in Dunfermline, which I won't name, in the 1990s, it was quite literally falling down.
Right.
And then latterly burned down. Thankfully, a weekend when nobody was in it, and they have now replaced it. But no, you're absolutely right. The quality of the school estate is noticeably, massively improved. In my experience, working in local papers, I used to go out in stories in schools fairly regularly. But yeah, it's night and day compared to what it was. But of course, the important thing is what happens in the classrooms.
Yes, yeah.
And that will be something that will be talked a lot about in the lead up to the 2026 Holyrood election, which we mentioned at the start of the episode. But just to kind of come back to that, we talked about some of the issues facing Scottish Labour. But on the flip side, our relatively new First Minister, John Swinney, who he's only been in the job since April, let us remind ourselves, even though it kind of feels like he's been there for quite a while now. He got a bit of a boost at the weekend when there was a poll that suggested that the SNP could be on course for 59 MSPs at the next Holyrood election. That would only be a drop of 3 on their current 62. And if, they were able to get some sort of deal with the Greens, then they could potentially, a very, very big if, remain in power for another 5 years. So coming to you, John, just number one, how would you rate John Swinney's job so far? How's he done? And two, can he be pretty confident now that he's going to do this? Is he on course for an election win, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, so it's a fascinating situation. If you were to have looked back on previous episodes of this programme and you listen to what other commentators had been saying a few months ago, almost everybody seemed to think that Labour would, on the back of their victory at Westminster, would have a bit of a honeymoon period. Keir Starmer would be very popular, and that Scottish Labour would get a boost off of that, that would kind of take them into the Holyrood election. And most people seem to think that Anas Sarwar was on course to become the next First Minister. That now looks to be not so likely, frankly. This most recent poll showed the SNP in a quite commanding lead, and it's not the only poll. There have been other polls suggested the same thing. The reality has been that the Labour at Westminster haven't had that honeymoon period they'd hoped for. They've actually proved to be really quite unpopular in many respects. And now, I mean, this is like they must be holding their head in their hands, because what's happened over the last month or so is that Rachel Reeves has handed the Scottish Government a huge pot of money to spend on public services. What John Swinney's decided to do with that is to reverse all of their most unpopular policies, i.e. the 2-child cap and the winter fuel payment. Now, I think we should add that he's actually been quite, he's been careful. They're not actually going to do these things next year. They have pushed these on to 2026, so they might never happen, and they might only happen if he actually does win the next election. But so I think, taken in the whole, you have to say that John Swinney does seem to be. First ministers have to take the luck that they get. Their success or failure tends to be dictated by other events, but nonetheless, he does seem to be playing the hand that he's being dealt quite well here. He seems to have steadied the ship, regained a bit of the SNP's previous reputation for just good common sense management, and he's made a few quite slick moves in terms of policy on the back of this new money that he's been getting in the budget. So, I mean, yeah, I think the tables seem to have been turned in Scottish Labour a bit, and it's going to make the next year very interesting.
Ben, do you still see Labour as having a clear path to victory? Is it still achievable for them, you think?
I think it's still achievable. I mean, I would agree with everything John said. Kind of in a way that Keir Starmer was very lucky in opposition, and it's all the cards seem to fall for him. John Swinney's had a similar amount of luck during his time in charge, and obviously he's very capable. He's a very sensible guy. He's not going to be pushed into doing something stupid. I mean, he might be, but it doesn't appear to be so far. Labour, a path to victory. I mean, yeah, I still think a hung parliament's the most likely outcome. So again, it probably comes down to the coalition partners. How many MSPs can the Lib Dems get? Can Labour, the Lib Dems and the Greens form a, if they can drive a wedge between the SNP and the Greens?
The Greens haven't ruled out the prospect of working with Labour in the future. Yeah. I think obviously a lot would depend upon how many MSPs each party got, but I think if it came to, I think the Greens could strike a deal with Labour. I feel there's a lot of water to flow under the bridge before that point. Just briefly to kind of finish on, is it all down to Keir Starmer? Is that what an Ass Star Wars future hinges on? How much agency does an ass have right now?
He's in control of his own destiny to some extent, isn't he? That politics is about personalities and what whether you can take people with you, that you can present some ideas and make people believe in them and make people believe that you are the person to lead the country. So to some extent, it's about an ass and how he conducts himself over the next year. But I think that there is the wider politics. So Scotland's this strange position where they've got an electoral cycle that's out of kilter with Westminster, and so at a time where Labour at Westminster are trying to take the tough, potentially unpopular decisions because they've got a few years until their next election, Labour in Scotland are having to deal with these decisions as they go into an election. I think the truth is, as much as we heard a lot about how in touch with Scotland Keir Starmer was and how much care, I think that it's just inevitable that it's 10% of the UK votes in Scotland, and he can't base all his decision making on what's going to be good for Scottish Labour. So I think an ass can control things, but it's what's happening in London is having a really big impact. I think that is just the winter fuel pay was huge, the 2-child cap probably to a lesser extent, but if the SNP are coming in saying we are going to reverse that, that's a big thing. I think the other thing that people kind of don't, so you've got these two big policies in terms of free prescriptions, free university education, that I think people feel that Labour are looking for ways to save money, to be more prudent, and that could these be threatened if Labour get in at Holyrood? And I think the other thing, which is people say that international issues don't have as big an impact domestic policies, but I do think that the fact that Labour's policy on Gaza is just out of step with public opinion, and for whatever reason the SNP seem to be able to present what is just seems to be a clearer and more humane policy there is also having a big impact.
Okay, well, a lot been discussed today, so my thanks to John Ferguson of the Sunday Mail and to Ben Borland of the Scottish Daily Express. So thanks for listening to this edition of Planet Holyrood. I'm sure regular listeners will be delighted to hear that Paul Hutchin will be back next week. But my thanks for your time today, and we'll see you again soon.
We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.
It's the same nonsense we've heard time and time again.